Good evening. You're watching The Digital Age. I'm Jim Zirin. Tonight we have a fascinating program for you on the role of the internet in the Islamic world. Reformers have websites where they preach a doctrine of moderation and rule of law. Terrorists such as Al-Qaeda have websites where they preach jihad and actually conduct terrorist operations. The State Department monitors the moderate websites and they see a ray of hope. The intelligence community moderates the terrorist websites and they prepare. So the internet has become a 21st century battleground in the war on terror. And this gives rise to our question for the evening: is the internet a force for good or evil in this war on terror? And here to discuss this important issue with us are two experts. First, Steve Cook is a Douglas Dillon Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's an expert on U.S. Middle East policy, as well as Turkish politics. Dr. Cook has traveled throughout the Middle East and has lived in Jerusalem, the West Bank, Cairo, Damascus, Ankara, and Istanbul. And Evan Kohlmann. Evan Kohlmann is an international terrorism consultant with years of experience tracking and analyzing Al-Qaeda and other 21st century global terrorist movements. He's lectured and given frequent briefings on transnational terrorist threats to the FBI, the National Security Council, and the Department of Homeland Security. During the summer of 2002, he went undercover in Europe to interview several prominent radical Islamic leaders linked to Al-Qaeda. His website, globalterroralert.com, informs on the latest developments in terrorist threats, propaganda, and operations. Now, first you, Steve, what is the state of play on reform in the Islamic and Arab world?
Well, there's a robust conversation going on within the Islamic world. We tend to hear mostly about the radical jihadis, given the situation in Iraq, the Hamas victory in Palestine, and obviously Evan has brought to light through his own work the thinking of radical Islamists. But there is a large and growing community in the Arab world and the larger Muslim world that is opposed to this type of interpretation of Islam. And although internet penetration in places like the Arab world is still rather small, there is a robust and hearty group of liberals who are blogging away on the web in order to undermine the message of the radical groups.
And we read recently about a Syrian woman, Dr. Wafa Sultan, lives in Los Angeles, Syrian American, and she went on Al Jazeera and the internet to criticize clerics who preach jihad. Would she be an example?
Well, she's certainly one example. I think Wafa Sultan is a bit unique. She does reside in Los Angeles and is, as people who saw the clip from Al Jazeera, thoroughly Americanized. And in taking a look at the Arab blogosphere after her appearance on Al Jazeera, many people did agree with her sentiments but didn't believe that she represented them. They felt that she had moved away from her own religion and had gone a bit too far. But nevertheless, I think it's important to recognize that there is a broad spectrum of debate that's going on within the Islamic world right now, and particularly interesting, a broad spectrum of debate within the clerical establishment in the Islamic world.
Now, Sultan writes for an Islamic reform website called Anaked, The Critic. Have you been on that website?
Well, since she appeared on Al Jazeera, people become very interested in her and where she appears and where she writes. Absolutely.
And is that one of the media whereby reform ideas are exchanged?
Well, certainly there are. There's a panoply of websites that people are writing. In addition to hers, there's many websites both in Arabic and English. Some of my favorite ones are the sandmonkey.com and the bigpharaoh.com. Those are some Egyptian bloggers who are proudly consider themselves not anti-Islamic but anti-jihadi and liberal Democrats at heart. So she certainly can be read, as well as many, many others who are reform-minded, liberal, democratic-minded, who see a much different vision for Arab and Muslim society than, for example, Al-Qaeda and some of the people that Evan has been tracking over the years.
Now, Evan, you deal with the dark side of the internet in the Arab world. You monitor and track Al-Qaeda websites, more than 80 Al-Qaeda websites since 9/11.
That's correct. It's interesting, and I think this is something that it's a bit of a paradox. In the beginning, when technology first came about in the 90s as a means of dissent, political dissent, I think it really was political reformers. It was liberals that really had the incentive and the lead in terms of using it. But during the 1990s, there was a dramatic shift in the sense that a new constituency began to take hold of this kind of technology in the Middle East. And you begin to see really the growth of a large number of not just jihadi websites, but jihadi chat rooms, jihadi chat forums, methods for these folks to speak to each other, to organize on the internet. And what's ended up happening is that these sites and these chat forums have largely outpaced the voices of reformers. And unfortunately, and it might surprise people to see this, but it's much easier to find a jihadi perspective on the internet than it is to find one of a reformer. I think people like Wafa Sultan are in the minority.
Well, without a doubt, it's certainly the case that just like the phenomenon with Arab satellite television, the radicals, the extremists, have been able to frame the terms of debate and have been more motivated to use these types of technologies. And as Evan surely knows, you can find instructions on how to go about conducting a suicide bombing operation on a jihadi website. It's very hard to find a formula for writing a constitution in the Arab world on the web. I think, though, we need to be a little careful in what we're talking about. Only the internet penetration in the Arab world, we're talking about the Arab world, not the Muslim world writ large, is only about 3.7%. But it's who are those 3.7%, which we have no way of telling. But by the raw numbers, it's a small number.
We have some idea, though, and I think demographics is a key issue here, and I think that's part of it. If you look at the people that are participating in these jihadi forums and these jihadi websites, and there are ways of tracking them, it seems that a large number of them are either in Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf states, or in Europe. And what that says is that the people that we have most to worry about, really, in this community are folks that are not necessarily in parts of the Middle East where we're most active, like Iraq, but in fact are in places where we consider to be allies of ours: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, the United Kingdom, France. These are the places where the most traffic comes from. And it's amazing that despite the efforts of the Saudi government in particular to crack down on their own locals accessing these jihadi websites, that they're still able to do so, and that they are the most prolific posters. They are the most prolific sources of information about terrorism and Al-Qaeda. And I think as demographics shift, and as internet access becomes more readily available in places like Egypt, places like Lebanon, places that I think have a more liberal alternative, we may see a growing number of voices to counter the jihadi perspective. So yes, demographics definitely is part of it.
And on the jihadi websites, we're seeing more, Evan, than just an expression of ideas, aren't we? The recipes for making a bomb, instructions for how to make a suicide vest. You can download a chilling clip of a beheading.
It's really actually incredible. Terrifying. If you look at the way technology has transferred over the internet, it's astounding. You have, for instance, you have a video called The Martyrdom Operation Vest Preparation, how to make a suicide bomb vest, including practice detonations against a fake bus, all right? This video, which was originally produced by Hezbollah, Shiite militants in southern Lebanon, has been exported via the internet to militants in Iraq associated with Al-Qaeda, to folks in the United Kingdom planning terrorist operations there, Sunnis, people that are absolutely opposed to Hezbollah, absolutely opposed to the Shiites. But that's the magic of the internet, really, is that this kind of knowledge becomes transferable between groups, between organizations, between units. And we know that these folks are studying this stuff. In fact, we know that the Madrid bombers, the folks responsible for the 3/11 bombings in Madrid, learned how to build bombs by studying recipes they found on the internet, on insurgent websites from Iraq. So this is a growing phenomenon. It's more than just chatting. It's more than just propaganda. It is the essential tools for terrorism. And today, there really is no way of separating out the internet from the world of terrorism. It is an integral tool for terrorists, just like a bomb, just like a gun, just like an airline ticket.
Now, if we analyze, Steve, the background of the 9/11 terrorists, there were both Shias and Sunnis who were involved in the operation. I mean, are we seeing this in the Arab world, that Sunnis and Shias are cooperating?
Well, certainly on some issues, the Sunnis and Shia have cooperated, and we should.
How about jihad?
Well, that's certainly it. And as we saw with the insurgency in Iraq, particularly during 2004, the Sunni-based Ba'athist insurgency were certainly cooperating with Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army in Iraq. So I think that jihad is an area where Sunnis and Shia can cooperate. But at the same time, you cannot dismiss the historic schism between Sunnis and Shia in the Arab world. Shia remain oppressed and second-class citizens in the areas where they predominate throughout the Arab world.
Well, to look at perhaps a positive note, maybe it's a positive note, there seem to be some indications that since the Amman, Jordan hotel bombings that Zarqawi and Jihad has lost some ground in the Arab world.
Well, it's certainly lost some ground in Iraq and Jordan. And I think the bombings in Jordan were mostly unpopular. I think it's true also that Americans only saw one perspective. The Jordanian government certainly wasn't advertising the alternate perspective, which was of Jordanians who supported this operation. That being said, I think generally speaking it was unpopular, and I think it reflects a growing unpopularity of al-Qaeda inside of Iraq. Recently, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was forced to dramatically shift his propaganda routine, his structure, by renaming his group, by joining Iraqi insurgents because of growing divisions between Sunni Iraqi insurgents who before were allied with al-Qaeda and now are beginning to decide that al-Qaeda is not the way forward, that the strategy of beheadings, of kidnappings, of suicide bombings, that's not the way to build a country. And so local Sunni Iraqis, I think, are starting to distance themselves from that. That being said, there is still a steady stream of recruits from across the Middle East, particularly in places like Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, that are willing to carry out Zarqawi's orders. And even as we corner him in Iraq, and even as his strategy becomes a little bit more desperate as time goes on, don't take that as an advertisement that Zarqawi's reign in the Middle East is over. If anything, he's at his most dangerous now because he's capable of unleashing acts of violence with no particular purpose. And we've seen recent attempted plots, again in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere, that all link back to his network.
And, and have his soldiers been recruited via the internet? Certainly journalists report that in Iraq, the 100%. Internet is a major force for recruiting
100%. There's no doubt. There's absolutely no doubt. In fact, there's empirical evidence to that. You'll have people that will go on these jihadi chat forums that are the most centrally important ones, the ones that are the most critical to the Zarqawi and the Iraqi insurgency. And they will actually say, after months of posting information about the Iraqi jihad and about how they're eager to go there, they will come around and say, now I'm going. Goodbye. Here's my login and password. Feel free to use my account. I don't need it anymore. And then just a few weeks later, someone else will post a message saying, well, you remember this guy, you remember this foreign participant that went over to Iraq? He was martyred yesterday in a suicide bombing attack. He was killed yesterday fighting U.S. forces in Bakuba. There is direct empirical evidence, never mind the undoubted thousands of people who have found their way to Iraq or Afghanistan who have been directly impacted by what they've seen on Al Jazeera, by what they've seen on the internet. In fact, almost every interview you do of a foreign insurgent who ends up in Iraq or Afghanistan, they will mention the influence of Al Jazeera, of Al Arabiya, of satellite network television, and of the internet.
Let me just parse something on this question of public opinion in Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, particularly in Jordan. While it's true, Zarqawi may have overstepped and overreached in going after Arab Muslims, I think if you looked at the public opinion polling immediately after that operation, people were saying that they were opposed to that particular operation. But, however, if this was an operation that was directed towards Americans or Israelis, you would have found a larger reservoir of support for it. In addition,
certainly these were hotels where Americans and Israelis has customarily stayed.
Exactly. And on this question of Zarqawi, he seems to have, although he is cornered and very dangerous, he seems to have succeeded in a long-term strategy in fomenting civil strife in Iraq. The Al-Asqariyah Shrine bombing that happened in February has increased and accelerated Iraq's slide into wide-scale civil conflict. And this is directly related, as Evan says, to his ability to recruit and propagate his propaganda on the internet.
Now, do you see evidence, Steve, that the government, you've traveled and visited Egypt and Bahrain and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Do you see evidence that these governments are cracking down at all on reform websites or bloggers?
Without a doubt, it seems that the governments that now are positioning themselves as reformers are cracking down on reformist-minded web bloggers. It's particularly the case, not so much in a place like Egypt. I think the Egyptians are interested in cracking down elsewhere, the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, but for example, in Bahrain, a country that the Bush administration has often held out as a model of a country that is moving forward on the path towards democratization or a more liberal, open political system. The Bahrainis can't get over some very bad habits, and they have consistently arrested bloggers, shut down the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, which had a presence on the internet as well. So it is certainly a problem. More so, what they do is they monitor what people are saying and make it difficult for people to view some of these bloggers.
The servers are state-owned, are they not, in most Arab
And there
countries?
aren't too many secure servers throughout the region. So, unfortunately, the same situation with China, where American technology firms are allowing the Chinese government to filter out certain content. The same kinds of things happen in the Arab world as well.
Well, in China, they found that most of the people logging onto the internet were not logging on in order to engage in political dissent, but to view pornography or to buy drugs. I mean, is that true in the Arab world as well?
Well, I just have some anecdotal evidence from that. I was waylaid in Bahrain for a few extra days waiting for a Saudi visa to come through a number of years ago and staying in one of the large hotels there that has a business center. And particularly on the weekend, Bahrain is very close to Saudi Arabia. There's a causeway that connects the two countries. On the weekend, it was very difficult to check my email at the business center because of the lines of Saudi men who are on the internet predominantly viewing pornographic websites.
Now, it's funny. This even goes with terrorists. In fact, a lot of times searching through computers owned and operated by terrorists, even places like Afghanistan, what's most amazing is not just finding jihadi material on there, but finding so much other material on there, showing the extent of which this computer is being used for, in particular, pornography. And I think this goes to the heart and kind of shakes the ideological foundations of some of these groups that are so misogynistic and have such a purist ideology. It conflicts with this, but I think it also shows how easily boundaries are crossed when it comes to technology.
Now, the United States, Evan, controls the internet, does it not?
Well,
we have the
technically speaking.
capability, certainly, to monitor all these sites. And we probably have the capability to kick them off the internet if we want to.
Yes, that's true.
And now, why don't we?
Well, it is amazing, and I think people would be surprised to realize that most terrorist websites, the most authentic ones, are almost exclusively based in American internet territory. Now, there's no way to prevent someone from putting up a website ahead of time. I mean, someone can always put up a site. It's always ultimately when we detect it, when we realize it's there. Now, it sometimes can take a few days before federal authorities can pick up on the fact that there's a new terrorist website in American internet territory. But the more fundamental question is, what do you do with it once you find it? Do you shut it down? Do you monitor it and try to figure out who's operating it? What are they saying? What is the information being passed on?
Who other than Evan Kohlmann is logging on?
Well, exactly. And I think ultimately that is the more effective strategy. There are some people out there, there are internet vigilantes, there are others whose philosophy is, as soon as we find a terrorist website, let's shut it down. But that's silly. That's like immediately finding Osama bin Laden's satellite telephone and shutting it down. No good intelligence operative is going to do it that way. The most effective way of doing this, number one, is to pull as much information as possible before shutting down these nodes. And second of all, if you're really interested in shutting down the node of information, the way of shutting it down is not technologically, but it is physically. It is tracking down the human webmaster, the human intellect that is responsible for this website, and arresting that person. Because simply shutting down a website, all that does is force this webmaster to set up a new website the next day. And we see this happen all the time.
As effective as burning a book.
Exactly.
Now, aren't there, however, CIA websites which are known as honeypots, which are designed to attract terrorists, maybe give them a recipe for a bomb, and when they start to make it, the bomb blows up in their face?
Well, certainly there's been a suggestion that that kind of thing is out there. And I would say, from what I know of the U.S. intelligence community, I have to assume that there's at least one or two honeypot sites out there. In fact, even Al-Qaeda has accused certain jihad websites, such as Jihad Unspun, of being a CIA intelligence gathering project for that exact purpose. And there has been a suggestion about putting out fake bomb manuals out there, putting out fake propaganda to mislead the jihadi community. There's two drawbacks to that. Number one, we're poisoning our own golden pot. The internet right now provides so much valuable information about terrorism, so much information that we don't have access to in any other way. It would seem to be a shame to poison that source of information with our own misinformation. And the second point being is that the jihadis are not stupid. We tend to look upon them as barbaric and as simplistic, but they're not. They're actually quite advanced in their thinking. And they typically can pick out a fake piece of news or a fake piece of propaganda out of the bunch, and they will remove it. They will edit it out, just like a good newspaper or a good blogger.
By the way, they're quite advanced technically. I mean, aren't a lot of their websites password protected?
Indeed. In fact, what's happened is because so much public attention has been drawn to the issue, these folks in some ways have gone underground in the fact that they've password protected their websites. They speak only in Arabic. Sometimes the communications are coded. They speak on chat forums where there is no log of what's going on. They know what they're doing. They're not that simplistic. In many ways, they're ahead of our own domestic law enforcement, and especially if you see technology like Skype, which allows anyone to have an encrypted telephone conversation with anyone else anywhere in the world. And the difficulty that law enforcement has in trying to monitor those communications, it cannot be underestimated. It is enormous. In fact, I would say that right now, and this is directly from people at the FBI, if there are people using technologies like Skype, like Vonage, to chat over the internet, terrorists, most likely there is nobody listening on the other end of the line.
Or by the time we crack the code, it's too late.
Bingo. Yeah, that's another issue that's come up.
And on the brighter side of the internet, our efforts, U.S. efforts to use the internet to kind of promote reform and change and democracy in the region and all those good things have consistently backfired. Our efforts to use the internet, satellite television, any kind of media, we are way behind the curve. In speaking out to the Arab and the Muslim world on these issues. What we've done on the internet and what we've done on the satellite television is regarded as crude U.S. propaganda.
I mean, that's what it is, though. If you look, the best example I can think of this is the website of CENTCOM. CENTCOM, in response to what
What is CENTCOM?
CENTCOM is U.S. Central Command, responsible for U.S. military operations, particularly in Iraq, but elsewhere as well.
Throughout the Middle East.
Throughout the Middle East. And I think one of the things that they try to do was try to respond to Zarqawi and others putting out so much information on the internet. So on their own website, they created a section called What Extremists Are Saying, which was supposed to be a venue for CENTCOM to air out the most ridiculous things, the most heinous, the most off-putting things that Zarqawi and bin Laden and Zawahiri were saying in order to show people the true face of evil. And it really, if you look at what that website looks like now, it looks like a 3-year-old put it together. It's childish, it's simple, half of it is in a foreign language that no American or no English speaker can understand. There's no formatting, it's impossible to read it, you can hardly find it. You'd have to be a miracle worker to find it to begin with on the website. And I think that's indicative of really the fact that there's been no intellect put behind this, that it's such a side project. And it's unfortunate because this goes back to the old winning hearts and minds strategy. Part of the battle in Iraq on the ground, part of the battle in Afghanistan on the ground is winning hearts and minds. And even folks in Iraq, even folks that are right there that see this for their very eyes, these people are still reading the internet. And folks across the Middle East are reading the internet. And for us not to try to harness that, it's shameful.
Well, what you say really plays into what Secretary Rumsfeld said recently at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I can quote him. He said, "Today's weapons of war include a global internet with no inhibitions, email, Blackberries, instant messaging, digital cameras, and blogs. Our enemies have skillfully adapted to fighting wars in today's media age, but our country has not. For the most part, the U.S. government still functions as a five and dime store in an eBay world." Do you agree with that?
Without a doubt. You just have to look at, as I said, our efforts on the internet, our efforts on satellite television, our efforts in the print media. We spent a lot of money, the U.S. government spent a lot of money on a magazine called High Magazine that was a dismal failure, that was supposed to win hearts and minds in the Arab world. El Hura, the flagship of our Hearts and Minds campaign, despite what the Broadcasting Board of Governors might say, has a very small viewership and is widely regarded as propaganda for the United States. I think that there is a place for the U.S. government in trying to win hearts and minds, but satellite television is not one of those places. Or we should actually change the format of El Hura to kind of highlight the democratic process, both here as well as in other democratic countries around the world. The fact remains is that we don't have the wherewithal as a government to do it. What we need to do is we need to let 1,000 flowers bloom, 1,000,000 flowers bloom, and not get in the way of people engaging in robust debate. I think one of the things, you say what you want about Al Jazeera, but I think one of the most important things about Wafa Sultan's appearance on Al Jazeera, of all places, is that she was seen by 40 million Al Jazeera viewers. So we do have a place in this debate, but we need to take a step back and really think about what our message is. This kind of childish websites like the one on CENTCOM or our crude efforts with High Magazine or Al Hura are really backfiring.
We should be addressing the extremists on their own forums. I mean, Al Jazeera is watched by millions of people throughout the Middle East. Al-Qaeda certainly does not consider Al Jazeera to be an ally of theirs. In fact, they constantly criticize Al Jazeera for being too pro-Western. If we want to engage a certain constituency, a certain demographic unit with our message, then we have to go to where they're listening. We can't simply shout out into the wind. We should be on Al Jazeera. We should have people speaking Arabic, speaking directly to the folks that we want to reach out to with a message that's coherent, that makes sense. By trying to spout out propaganda through something that is viewed by people in the Middle East as propaganda, no one will ever take that seriously. If we want to counter the extremists, we have to counter them on their own territory, on their own domain. We have to come face to face, and we have to have people in the U.S. government and the U.S. military who are capable of making those arguments, who are capable of making them well, and who don't shrink from a confrontation with an extremist.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up, but I want to ask you a question. And the question is the net a force for good or evil in the Islamic world?
Well, right now, I'd say it's somewhere in between. It's a balance, and ultimately the balance will be determined by the actions of governments in the region and by the United States.
And Steve Cook, what do you say?
I think it's a wash, and I think it has less to do with governments and it has to do with people, and that people are being motivated to engage in this debate, and it should be encouraged, but we don't have a role in it.
It's all about people. Evan Kohlmann, thank you for coming by.
Thank you very much.
Steve Cook, thank you for coming
by. It's a real pleasure.
And thank you for coming by. I'm Jim Zirin. Tune in next week for more from the digital age. Good night.